this segment, I want to continue talking about the behavioral sciences and about public opinion research. In the last segment on polling, I discussed the scientific basis for polling. And I maintain that if you use a random sample, you have neutrally worded questions, and you have professional, neutral interviewers, you can rely on a poll within a range of accuracy to a level of confidence. That makes it a scientifically accurate poll. Of course, it's important to remember that it's only valid on the day it's taken or shortly thereafter. So there are limitations on polling. And now I'm going to discuss another limitation and some of the newer trends in political behavior. Some of them are covered under a name, Infotopia. Infotopia is the idea that people who answer polling questions may not be, even to themselves, understanding about their true beliefs and behaviors. There's always been a question about whether people lie on polls. And people who believe in polling tend to poo-poo this, saying, well, people aren't basically liars, and if there are liars one way, there'll be liars on the other side, so the polls are still accurate. Infotopia is a little different. It's not actually saying there's liars. What it's saying is that people who answer a poll don't have a stake in their answers. So they may give you an answer that that's not a deeply held belief of theirs. And so, if you're taking a poll on, say, a candidate, some of the people who answer the question may be completely devoted to that candidate, or completely devoted to their political party, and they would never think of doing other than giving an accurate answer that named their favorite candidate or named their party's nominee. But some of the people won't have that level of attachment to the party or the nominee, and they may slough off the answer without thinking about it very clearly. What does Infotopia do? Well, Infotopia says if you had people who had a stake in their answers, they might answer more carefully. For example, suppose they had money riding on it. You say, well, polling doesn't have anything to do with money, and that's right, they don't. But there's another thing that goes on in America. People bet on outcomes. People bet on the outcome of sporting events. It's illegal in a lot of places, but they do it anyway. So people will bet on March Madness. They'll bet on the winner of a football game, and they'll even do the spread of points in the game. A lot of betting goes on. And something very funny happened when they were doing some of the betting. People bet on, this was discovered with regard to the Academy Awards. The Academy Awards for Best Picture and all that sort of stuff are given by the Academy. And every year people ask polling questions about who the average person in America thinks will win Best Actor, or which picture will win the Best Award. Now they're not voting on it. Only the Academy's voting, but they're trying to guess what the Academy's going to do. And they answer the polls, and they discovered something. And the polls weren't really very accurate. Now these were not voters, they're not in the Academy, they're just the general public. But the general public can guess, and you'd think they might have a pretty good idea what the best picture was, or the best actor, or the best actress. But it turns out that better than polling are the odds makers in Las Vegas. Whoa, how's that? Well, it turns out that people who are making a bet, taking dollars out of their back pocket and laying them down on the table and saying, I think Joe Blow was the best actor, and I think the Academy is going to decide that. When they are conscious that they've put money on the table, they actually dig deeper in their own psychology to try to come up with the answer. Why? Because they've got money on the table. They're going to lose the money if they guess wrong. And so it turns out that they discovered that better than any of the national polls were the Infotopia results. And that led them to think, maybe that applies to political contests as well. If people are actually guessing on who's going to win, we might get different results than we did if we just did public opinion polling. And sure enough, they did. And sure enough, something else. They got better results from Infotopia than they did from polling. This is not the old argument about people lying on polls. Sometimes people do lie on polls. But that's not the old argument. This is a new argument that says people who have money on the table are more likely to concentrate their thinking and to make better guesses on an outcome than people who don't have a stake in whatever decision they make. Now, this part of the polling so far has only been a discussion of candidates in an election. And polling has always been limited with regard to candidates in an election. And here's why. If you look at most polls that predict things well, they're predicting landslides. If it is obvious that one candidate has a long lead and is likely to win the presidency with 60% of the popular vote, most people in America are going to know that. So most people in 1964 knew that Lyndon Johnson was going to defeat Barry Goldwater, and he did, by about 60% of the vote. Later, when it was Richard Nixon running against George McGovern, most people knew that Richard Nixon was likely to win, and by gum, he won by 60% of the vote. And Ronald Reagan over Walter Mondale in 1984, yep, they knew Reagan was going to win, and he won by maybe 56% of the vote. So if you have a landslide, or you have a wide margin, the polling is excellent. But then, of course, you don't need a poll for that. Your own intuitive reaction to someone who's a runaway winner is likely to be as good as the poll is. So polling doesn't help there. But what about close contests? Well, close contests like Bush versus Gore in 2000, or close contests like Bush versus Kerry in 2004, or close contests like Obama versus McCain. You might say, well, in those contests, we really want to know the poll results. Yeah. But the results you're going to get are going to fall within the margin of error. So you're not going to really know the outcome based on the polling because of the margin of error. Polling for candidates only is limited to a range that runs from 55 to 45%. If it's closer than that, it's within the margin of error. If it's wider than that, like 60-40, you don't need the poll to start with. That's a clear limitation on what polling can do. And polling is limited when you're focusing on candidates alone. In fact, in those cases, Infotopia may be a better result. So if that's the case, why do we even bother with polling at all? Why even have public opinion research if it's subject to this limitation? We have public opinion research because there are other things you can do with polling other than ask who's going to win the next election. You can also ask questions about people's positions on public policy. You can also ask questions about people's values. And in these areas, public opinion research continues to be very valid. Now let's take a look at some of these examples. Let's take a look at an example like party affiliation. What do we know about party affiliation? Well, we periodically get numbers that divide this country, and for the last 3 or 4 decades, this country has been divided 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. 1/3 Democrats, 1/3 Republicans, and 1/3 independents. And that's not a perfect 33, 33, 33. That's sometimes as high as 38% for the Democrats, sometimes as high as 38% for the Republicans, sometimes as high as 42% for the independents, with the other 2 parties taking the rest. But roughly 1/3. We feel comfortable with that. But the problem with that is it's only a general orientation toward political parties or toward independents. It doesn't actually tell you how those people are going to vote. There were elections in the Bush elections in which more people said they were Democrats, yet Bush won in 2004, for example. No question about it, he won in 2004. But the people were supposed to be Democrats. Well, yes, they were Democrats, but some of them liked Bush better than they liked Kerry. And so Bush won. Now, what about questions about public policy? Well, there are public policy questions about which the answer is clear. I'll take one example from the state of Tennessee. Only one example. It's not a position in which I'm taking a stand, and I'm not raising this question because I want to come down on one side or the other. I just want you to know what the results show. Let's take a question about whether capital punishment is a legitimate punishment for a crime like first-degree murder. In fact, all across America, almost only the only crime for which capital punishment is used is first-degree murder, though there are a couple of states that have some other provisions. Let's take a look at it. What is the state of opinion in this state on whether capital punishment is a legitimate penalty for first-degree murder? The answer is, and I'm sure of this, all of the time I've spent in Tennessee, more than 4 decades now, a majority of the people in this state have answered yes. Capital punishment is a legitimate thing for the state to do with regard to a crime like first-degree murder. Now, what has happened? Well, it has varied. There was a time back in the 1950s when some of the people in the state had raised questions about the unfairness of capital punishment. And it was reaching a point where almost half, not yet half, but almost half were saying, we don't need capital punishment. We should join those states that don't use capital punishment. But then, as a result of changes in levels of crime, changes in attitudes toward crime, again, the pro-capital punishment people began to rise. And for most of the last 40 years, it's been about 70% to 80% who said capital punishment is legitimate, which means on the other side, only 20 to 30% opposed to capital punishment. Now, have those percentages changed? Yep. Let there be a string of violent crimes that just outrage everybody, and people start saying, we need to kill those people who killed other people in such a grisly way. And the percentage of people who support capital punishment goes up. Let there be a question, as sometimes happens, about whether someone has been wrongly accused and sentenced to die. And questions are raised about whether the trial was fair, whether the evidence had been tampered with, whether the evidence was complete, something like that. And lo and worst, let there be somebody who was executed, and then questions are raised about whether they were guilty. And you'll find that there's a shift in opinion. Is public opinion polling valuable? Yeah, it is. For a core issue like capital punishment, people feel strongly enough so you can rely, not perfectly, but to a considerable degree on the answers they give. Or an issue that's colored by religious thinking, like abortion, or other hot-button issues, same-sex marriage, a whole range of these highly emotional issues. In those cases, you don't need to have people willing to lay the money down. They already have strongly held opinions, and it's worth knowing what those opinions are. And public opinion polling can be useful for that purpose. Public opinion polling can be also useful for determining other underlying cultural values, which happen to vary widely. We think of ourselves as having an American culture, and we do. There are certain elements that happen to be typical wherever you go in the United States. An orientation toward democracy, a support for the Constitution, but these are very general values. When you go to more specific values having to do with sex or rules governing sex or capital punishment or support for education or willingness to support government expenditures, these will vary widely based on the underlying culture. And public opinion research is useful and valuable for that. What are some of the things we know for sure? Well, let me give you a few. I've already discussed the fact that we know party orientation pretty well. About 1/3 are Democrats, 1/3 are Republicans, and 1/3 are independents. And I should say, when I say that independents continue to get the lion's share. They've been above 33 1/3% for quite some time. Then we have, where do these values come from? Well, it turns out most people, about 2/3 of the people, have the same party affiliation as their parents. So if both parents were Democrats, about 2/3 of the children of those two Democrat family heads, about 2/3 of them will be Democrats. If both parents were Republicans, about 2/3 of their children are likely to be Republican. I know people change their mind when they become adults. About 1/3 of them do. And And then there are people like me. I had a mother who was a Democrat and a father who was a Republican. And I've been pretty much an independent all my life. Though, like everyone, I need to find party affiliation if I choose to run for public office. This is the kind of thing that is useful for public opinion research. And this is where polling is increasingly valuable.